They had never lost a major battle, not in 50 years. They had torn down empires, Khwarezmia, the Abbasid Caliphate, entire swathes of Russia and China, turning the capitals of the world into dust and bone. The name Mongol was a terror whispered on the wind from the Pacific Ocean, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And I was standing there, a former slave, a Mamluk cavalryman in the army of Egypt, staring down the very edge of their unstoppable advance, knowing that in a few hours my life, the fate of Egypt, and perhaps the future of the entire known world would be decided in a tiny, insignificant valley called Ain Jalut. We were the last ones left. Baghdad was a grave. Damascus had been sacked. They had sent us a letter, their usual ultimatum, arrogant and chilling, demanding surrender, telling us to dig our own graves before they arrived, promising that the ground beneath our horses would soon be soaked with the blood of our children. My blood ran cold just reading the words, a knot of pure, desperate fear tightening in my stomach, but a fire, a fierce, blazing rage, ignited right alongside it. Was this the end? Was I about to witness the final darkness fall upon the Islamic world? The one the poets would mourn for 1,000 years? Or could we, a collection of Turkish and Circassian slave soldiers, the Mamluks, actually do what no one else had done? Could we draw the first real, deep, bleeding wound on the face of the Mongol Empire? I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand what it felt like to stand against the unstoppable. And I need you to tell me if, given the terror we faced, the desperate gambit we risked at Ain Jalut was the only sane choice left. My name is not important, but I was one of the many. I started my life as a boy captured in the Kipchak steppe, far to the north, sold into the slave markets of Cairo, and trained to be a Mamluk. That's what our entire society was built on, this strange, fierce, brutal meritocracy of slave soldiers. We were purchased as boys, given a home, a language, a purpose, and trained, drilled, and beaten until we were the finest cavalry force in the world. We were owned by the Sultan, yes, but our loyalty was to the system, to each other, and to the power we collectively wielded. That power had recently shattered, though. The last Sultan of the old line had been murdered, and a new one, a fierce, pragmatic, and utterly unyielding man named Qutuz, had seized the throne amidst the chaos, just in time to inherit the terror of the Mongol horde. It was 1259 and the world was ending, one magnificent city at a time. The Mongol Ilkhan Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, was marching west. They were not just an army. They were a cataclysm. I remember the stories that filtered back to Egypt, tales of the siege of Baghdad, how the rivers ran black with the ink of the library's books and red with the blood of 500,000 souls. The Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of all Sunnis, dragged from his palace and rolled up in a carpet to be kicked to death by Mongol horses. It was an act of pure, systematic annihilation, a demonstration of contempt for civilization itself. When the Mongol ambassador arrived in Cairo, the fear was a physical weight in the streets. The ultimatum was curt, utterly dismissive of our existence. It said, "You have heard how we have conquered a vast world and purified the earth of the disorders that contaminated it. Upon you is incumbent the duty of flight, and upon us the duty of pursuit." Qutuz the Sultan did not flinch. He was a man of cold, hard resolve, forged in the same fire as the rest of us. He did what no one else had dared. He executed the Mongol envoys. Their heads were impaled on the gates of Cairo. That single, defiant act was our declaration of war, a line drawn in the sand of the desert that said, "Here, you stop." The choice had been made for us, fight or die. And I, like every other Mamluk, strapped my quiver of composite arrows and sharpened my scimitar, a quiet, terrifying certainty settling over me. We were going to war with fate itself. The army we assembled was small, perhaps 20,000 strong, but every man was a veteran, every one of us a master horse archer, a living weapon. Our general, the true master of the campaign, was Baibars. Baibars. He was a man with eyes like a hawk, a brilliant, ruthless commander who had climbed the ranks through sheer talent. He was the tactical genius, Qutuz the final authority. We marched out of Cairo, across the Sinai Peninsula, and into the broken lands of Palestine, lands that had been fought over for centuries by crusaders and caliphs. The crusaders were still there, holed up in their coastal castles, terrified of both us and the Mongols and utterly useless. We needed to push into Syria, to meet the enemy before they could cross the narrow choke points that protected Egypt. We were marching toward the unknown, knowing that the main bulk of Hulagu's army had suddenly withdrawn back to the Mongol heartland. Their great Khan Munka had died. It was a reprieve, a gift from a distant, unknown god. Hulagu had taken most of his massive force to deal with the succession crisis, leaving behind only a vanguard of around 10,000 to 20,000 men under the command of his most trusted general Kitbuka. This was our chance. A small chance, but a chance nonetheless. We had to destroy Kitbuka's force utterly, leaving nothing for Hulagu to return to. The plan Baibars devised was as elegant as it was terrifying. A Mongol trap turned against its inventors. He chose the battlefield carefully. The valley of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, a place steeped in history and strategically perfect, a narrow opening of terrain near the town of Basin. It was September 3rd, 1260. The air was hot, dusty, and absolutely silent with anticipation. Baibars and I, with a small advance force, were the bait. Our mission was to ride into the valley, draw the Mongol force out of their camp, and then feign a catastrophic retreat. The feigned retreat, it was the Mongols' signature move, the one that had fooled countless armies into breaking formation and rushing headlong into a deadly, pre-planned ambush. And we were going to use it on them. It felt insane. A psychological warfare game where a single misstep meant the complete annihilation of our advance guard and the collapse of the entire army's morale. Qutuz, with the main body of our cavalry, was hidden in the hills and wooded gullies that flanked the valley. I remember Baibars, his face grim, giving his final orders. He simply said, "Ride fast, shoot straight, and pray we are not the ones they chase to the death." I adjusted the grip on my bow. My heart was pounding like a war drum against my ribs. We rode out a thin line of desperate men, and soon we saw them. The Mongols. Their banners, their distinctive leather armor, the terrifying sight of their compact, disciplined cavalry. They were magnificent, terrible, and utterly confident. Kitbuka, their general, saw us. A small scouting force, and he must have smiled. An easy kill. He ordered his main body forward to crush us. Baibars fired the first arrow, and the battle was joined. We skirmished, firing our arrows into their charging ranks. Then, exactly as planned, we broke. We turned our horses and fled back toward the shelter of the hills. The Mongols swallowed the bait. The scent of an easy victory was too sweet for them to resist. They abandoned their disciplined formation and spurred their horses into a wild, joyous chase, shouting their war cries, certain they were about to scatter and destroy us. They streamed past the hills where Qutuz and the main Mamluk army lay concealed. I could hear their shouts, their heavy hoofbeats drumming on the dry earth, feeling them gain on me, the thwack of their arrows hitting the ground behind my horse's hooves. My whole being was screaming at me to keep running, to escape this hell. But I had to lead them deeper, closer to the trap. It was the longest, most agonizing ride of my life. And then, the signal. A clear, sharp horn blast from the hills to our left. It was Qutuz. The trap was sprung. The main Mamluk force exploded out of the valleys, not in a disorganized rush, but in two perfectly timed, devastating wings that slammed into the flanks of the pursuing Mongols. The sound was not a shout. It was a physical blow. The shock of 1,000 horses hitting flesh and armor. We, the advance guard, wheeled our horses around in a maneuver we had drilled 1,000 times, stopping our retreat to rejoin the fight, suddenly transforming from panicked prey back into ferocious predators. The Mongols were caught. The pursuers became the surrounded. The sheer shock on their faces, the split second of absolute confusion as they realized the impossible had happened, was the most satisfying moment of my entire soldier's life. But the Mongols were not ordinary men. They were the children of the steppe. Bred for war and even trapped, they fought with a desperate ferocity that was breathtaking. Their counterattack was brutal. They didn't break. They simply tightened their ranks, and the fighting dissolved into a brutal, close-quarters melee. The Mongol right flank was pushing us back, their heavy cavalry smashing through our line. I saw the line waver, our men starting to give ground, the terrible whisper of fear returning, threatening to undo the entire battle. It looked like the trap was failing, that even a reduced Mongol force was too much, too inherently superior in battle for us to defeat. We were being pushed toward the center of the valley, our wings collapsing. This was the moment of truth, the point where every other army in history had broken, scattered, and been annihilated. The fate of Egypt was truly hanging by a thread, and I was in the thick of it, my scimitar rising and falling, my body aching with effort, my lungs burning with dust. We were about to be outflanked, encircled, and destroyed. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. We were on the verge of the very destruction we had worked so hard to avoid. The general, Kitbuka, was rallying his troops, his deep booming voice cutting through the din of battle, and his men were responding, pushing us to the brink. Before I tell you what happened next, what I saw the Sultan do to save us all, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have kept fighting in that crumbling line? Or would you have turned your horse and fled, saving yourself and letting the Mongol wave finally crest and crash over the world? Tell me honestly, what would have been your last desperate action? Then came the roar that transcended the chaos. It wasn't the shout of 1,000 men, it was the sound of one man utterly possessed. Sultan Qutuz, our cold, calculating leader, threw off his helmet. I saw his face stripped of its armor, pale with exertion and lit with a divine, terrible fury. He charged, not toward a safe flank, but straight into the thickest, most desperate part of the crumbling line, yelling a battle cry that ripped through the air. "O Islam! O God, give your servant Qutuz victory!" He was a sultan, a general, a former slave, and he was fighting like a common soldier in the front rank. It was an act of raw, suicidal courage, and it changed everything. Seeing the leader throw himself into the breach, risking everything, was the electrical shock we needed. A wave of renewed, almost religious zeal swept through our ranks. I felt it myself, a second wind, a surge of adrenaline that replaced the fear with a fanatical determination. The Mamluk reserves, who had been holding back, seeing their sultan in mortal danger, broke their formation and charged in after him, a massive hammer blow that stabilized the line and slammed into the Mongol right flank. The tide turned instantly. The Mongols were still fighting brilliantly, but they were now faced with a fresh fanatic force led by a man who had no intention of retreating or surrendering. The fighting intensified into a swirling maelstrom, but now the pressure was on them. I was riding shoulder to shoulder with men I had served with for years, screaming, fighting with a desperation born of knowing this was the last possible chance. I saw Kitbuka, the Mongol general, trying to rally his men, his voice strained, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. They were trapped, and they knew it. The sheer weight of our counterattack, the ferocity of the Mamluk charge broke their will. The Mongol line finally irrevocably shattered. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a panicked, bloody rout. They fled, their discipline abandoning them for the first time in history. The aftermath was a relentless pursuit. We chased them all the way to the town of Basin, showing no mercy, no quarter. The memory of Baghdad, the severed heads of our own envoys, the terror that had gripped the world, it all fueled our vengeance. Kitbuka himself was captured. Brought before Qutuz, the proud general, now a prisoner, was defiant to the end. I didn't hear his final words, but I saw Qutuz pass the cold, swift judgment. The general who was to lead the Mongols to the gates of Egypt had his head severed from his body. It was then sent to Cairo, a grim, glorious message nailed to the walls that had once held the heads of his own ambassadors. The Mongols had been beaten utterly and completely, their army destroyed, their general executed. The Battle of Ain Jalut was over, and we had won. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the stench of death, but the valley was ours. The world had been saved, not by distant kings or great empires, but by a slave army from Egypt. The consequences were immediate and vast. News of the victory spread like wildfire. The seemingly invincible Mongol wave had finally been broken, and the entire Middle East breathed a collective sigh of relief. Syria was liberated, the Mongol garrisons fleeing in terror, and Qutuz marched into Damascus as a triumphant savior. But the story of the Mamluks is never a simple one. The politics that follow a great victory are often bloodier than the battle itself. Baibars, the man whose tactical genius had engineered the victory, was a man of boundless ambition. He felt Qutuz had failed to reward him adequately. Specifically, Baibars wanted the governorship of Aleppo, and Qutuz, perhaps wary of his general's power, had refused. On the return march to Cairo, a plot was hatched among the inner circle. As Qutuz was on a hunting trip, or perhaps simply resting, Baibars and a handful of other disgruntled Mamluks set upon him. The Sultan, the savior of Egypt and the man who had stood up to the Mongols, was murdered by his own hand-picked officers. I was not there for that betrayal, but the news was like a second shockwave. It was a cold, brutal end to a spectacular moment of heroism. Baibars immediately took the throne. The Mamluk state had a new sultan, forged in blood, both Mongol and Egyptian. The new sultan, Baibars, proved to be an even more formidable enemy to the Mongols, consolidating our power, pushing them out of Syria entirely, and establishing a dynasty that would last for centuries. The line in the sand had held, and it was a line the Mongols would never cross again in force. Ain Jalut was not just a battle. It was the birth of an empire, the day the world shifted. It showed that even the most terrifying, most successful empire could be stopped, not by larger numbers or superior technology, but by courage, discipline, and a perfectly executed, desperate strategy. It was a victory bought with the blood of former slaves, and it changed my life forever, making me a free man in a land that was finally safe. I saw the impossible happen, and I became a part of a legend. This story, the legend of Ain Jalut, is a lesson in desperate hope. It's about standing firm when the entire world expects you to crumble. We were the last domino, and we refused to fall. We held the line. My life was defined by that terrifying ride, that moment of turning from flight to fight and the fierce, terrible courage of a desperate sultan. The memory of the dust, the blood, and Qutuz's screams still echo in my mind. He gave us the chance, and we took it. The empire was stopped, but the cost was astronomical even for the victor. Like this video if you were on my side, if you think we did the only thing we could have done, and subscribe for more stories like this. Tales of desperation, betrayal, and the moments when the impossible became reality. Tell me, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Was Baibars a necessary evil, or simply a cold-blooded traitor who stole the glory of the man who saved the world? I'll see you all in the next story.